This morning,
Welcome back
the
to
British
part 2 of our
ambassador in
screencast on the
Berlin
road to World War II.
handed the German
In
government
part 1, we looked
a
at some of the
final
efforts
note
to keep the peace after World
stating
War
that
I, the
unless
war
we
to end
heard
all
from them
wars.
by
And we also
11
looked at the
o'clock
rise of
that
totalitarianism
they
in the
were prepared
1920s and
at
30s,
once to
and
withdraw
finished
their
off with
troops
the
from
aggression
Poland,
of Japan and
a
Italy,
state of
two of the
war
Axis
would
partners.
exist between us.
In part 2 today, we're going to look at
I have
Germany's
to tell you
aggression
now
in the
that
1930s.
no such
And to do
undertaking
that,
has
we're
been
going to
received,
backtrack you to about 10
and that
years,
consequently
to
this
1923
country
and
is
1924,
at
when
war
Hitler was
with
composing his
Germany.
book Mein Kampf. You might remember that in Mein Kampf, Hitler laid out exactly what he would do if and when he got into power in Germany. And when he took power in 1933 and 34, he proceeded to do exactly what he had laid out. We've seen in the film Master Race that his goal for Germany was a single race state, and all the various measures he took to make that happen. We also know from Mein Kampf that one of Hitler's goals was Lebensraum, or living room or living space for the German people. In Hitler's case, his rationale would be that any lands he took over were actually German lands occupied by German-speaking peoples, and therefore he wasn't taking anything, he was simply reclaiming what was rightfully his and Germany's to begin with. It starts in 1935 and 1936, when Hitler first occupies the Ruhr and Saar valleys, and then in 1936, the Rhine River Valley. These had been set aside as demilitarized buffer zones between Germany and France as part of the Treaty of Versailles. So Hitler's occupation of these territories was in direct violation of the treaty. However, the Ruhr and Saar were too rich in coal and iron for Hitler to resist, especially as he was going to use them to build up his industrial strength as well as his newly expanding military, which, by the way, was also outlawed by the Treaty of Versailles. In 1938, Hitler moved into his old native country of Austria and annexed or added Austria into what Hitler was now referring to as Greater Germany. This Anschluss, as the union was called, was also prohibited by the Treaty of Versailles, but because it was fairly popular with the Austrian German-speaking population, and because the Allies were unwilling to stand up to Hitler for fear of war, it was allowed to take place anyway. By late 1938, Hitler had cast his eyes on the western section of Czechoslovakia, known as the Sudetenland, where some 2 to 3 million German-speaking peoples lived. The problem with the Sudetenland was that Czechoslovakia did have agreements of sorts with the British and the French, which meant that if Hitler tried to annex this territory, he was possibly risking a direct conflict with not just Czechoslovakia, but with the British and the French as well. After some intense back and forth long distance, the leaders decided to meet in Munich, Germany in September of 1938 to try to resolve what Chamberlain referred to as the Czechoslovakian problem. Who's Neville Chamberlain? He's the fellow in the upper left-hand corner of the screen, the Prime Minister of Great Britain. You know the fellow in the lower left-hand corner. Chamberlain was accompanied by the Premier of France, Edouard Daladier, and they sat on one side of the table at the Munich conference. On the other side of the table, Hitler was joined by his fascist partner and Axis partner, Benito Mussolini. So we've got Great Britain, France, Germany, and Italy. You might notice there's somebody missing. That's right. The Czechs themselves were not allowed to be part of this conference. Imagine going to a conference where your fate and your future are hanging in the balance, and you have nothing to say about it. Obviously, the Czechs are putting a lot of hope into the Allies that they'll be able to negotiate a solution which allows them to maintain their state and maintain their sovereignty. Unfortunately for them, it wasn't to be the case. Chamberlain and Daladier eventually gave in and signed an agreement allowing Hitler to annex the Sudetenland with the Allies' blessing. Chamberlain returns to the airport And if you want to hear his speech and actually see him give part of the speech,
So our Prime Minister has come back from his third and greatest journey, and he said
that the settlement of the Czechoslovakian problem, which has now been achieved, is, in my view, only the prelude to a larger settlement in which all Europe may find peace. This morning, I had another talk with the German Chancellor, Herr Hitler. And here is the paper which bears his name upon it as well as mine. Some of you perhaps have already heard what it contains, but I would just like to read it to you. We, the German Führer and Chancellor, and the British Prime Minister have had a further meeting today and are agreed in recognizing that the question of Anglo-German relations is of the first importance for the two countries and for Europe. We regard the agreement signed last night and the Anglo-German naval agreement as symbolic of the desire of our two peoples never to go to war with one another again. We are resolved that the method of consultation shall be the method adopted to deal with any other questions that may concern our two countries, and we are determined to continue our efforts to remove possible sources of difference and thus to contribute to assure the peace of Europe.
there was no sign of British reserve as the crowds fought to get near the Premier's car.
Photo. Chamberlain is waving the piece of paper that has his name and Hitler's. Throughout the whole speech, Chamberlain makes reference to Czechoslovakia once, and only once. It's pretty clear that Chamberlain has more on his agenda than just rescuing the Czechs. He wants to guarantee peace in our time. He does this through a policy called appeasement. Appeasement is defined as giving in to an aggressor in the hopes of avoiding conflict. Let's give a basic example. Imagine that you're babysitting, and you're babysitting a young child who basically tells you that if you don't give him a cookie, he's going to start screaming his head off. You don't want him to scream. You don't want that hassle, so you give him the cookie. He's quiet, but he's happy because he now knows a valuable lesson. He knows that this crying thing works. So the next time he wants a cookie, he'll start screaming again. Essentially, this is what happens to Chamberlain as the result of an appeasement policy. Hitler screams and beats the drums of war. In order to avoid that war, Chamberlain signs off on this piece of paper to get Hitler's signature as well. Chamberlain, to his credit, gets a pretty popular reception at the airport. The reputation of Chamberlain throughout the years has been as a naive coward who backs down the first time a dictator screams at him, but you need to remember also that Chamberlain represents a people that don't want war any more than he does. The idea of believing in peace as opposed to war is called pacifism, and along with appeasement, these are the two forces that drive Chamberlain to ask for peace in our time. And while he shouldn't get total blame or responsibility for what happens in the ensuing months and years, it is true that the Allies probably could have stood up to Hitler. Remember Newton's laws. Objects in motion stay in motion until opposed by a significant force. So by 1938, Hitler had not only occupied what had been Germany pre-World War I, he had also annexed Austria, the Sudetenland, and by early 1939 occupied eastern Czechoslovakia as well. If you follow the pattern, next on Hitler's list would have been Poland. Poland provides an interesting problem for Hitler. Unlike Czechoslovakia, Poland has agreements with Britain and France that are pretty much ironclad. Therefore, if Hitler invades Poland, it's war with Britain and France, pretty much without question. A second problem for Hitler is that an invasion of Poland puts him on the doorstep of the Soviet Union, then under the control of Joseph Stalin. In essence, he'd be knocking at the door of the world's #1 communist. And you may remember that communists and fascists don't play well together. Therefore, if he attacked Poland, Hitler faced the possibility of a two-front war. Britain and France to the west, the Soviets to the east, pretty much the same scenario that did Germany in at the end of the First World War. How does Hitler avoid this problem? He comes up with a solution. And it works in large part because it's the most unbelievable possibility as well. The Nazi-Soviet Pact in 1939. Essentially, the world's #1 fascist and the world's #1 communist agree that they're not going to go to war with each other. Keep in mind, their stated goals pretty much involve elimination of the other way of thinking totally. The one thing Hitler wants is Stalin dead. The one thing Stalin wants is Hitler dead. Why this agreement? Well, in addition to the non-aggression treaty clause, there's also an agreement that essentially Eastern Europe's going to be divided up between the two of them. Hitler grabbing the western section of Poland, Stalin is going to use that opportunity to grab the eastern half of Poland, as well as the Baltic states of Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. The cartoon you see here in the upper left-hand corner is by the British cartoonist David Lowe. His work is probably some of the most famous coming out of Europe pre-World War II. In the cartoon, Hitler greets Stalin as the scum of the earth, I believe, and Stalin replies to Hitler, "Bloody assassin of the workers, I presume." I don't think you need to know who the body is that's kind of lying in between them. Obviously, it's Poland. This worked nonetheless because it was so totally unexpected. It was truly a shocking event. And you only wondered how long the honeymoon would last. It wouldn't last that long. It was pretty clear that they were going to go to war at some point. But for Hitler, the pact gives him time to take over Poland and hopefully defeat the British and the French, and therefore when he finally attacks Stalin, he'll be fighting a single front war. Stalin, on the other hand, is perfectly happy to let Hitler fight Poland, Britain, and France, and in the meantime will shore up his own defenses so that when the war, the inevitable war, comes, he'll be ready for it and be able to crush Hitler as he actually intends to do. When they say there's no honor among thieves, this is pretty much what they're talking about. But with that last obstacle out of the way, there's nothing to stop Hitler from invading Poland, which he does on September 1st, 1939. 2 days later, Chamberlain will give a speech over the radio from 10 Downing Street that will take on a much different tone than his address at the airport 1 year earlier.
This morning, the British ambassador in Berlin handed the German government a final note stating that unless we heard from them by 11 o'clock, that they were prepared at once to withdraw their troops from Poland, a state of war would exist between us. I have to tell you now that no such undertaking has been received, and that consequently this country is at war with Germany.
You can access the sound file on Edmodo also in your folder. Suffice it to say that Chamberlain's in a much different mood, because as of September 3rd, 1939, the Second World War has officially begun, and it won't get any better from here. We'll see you soon.